All right. Well, hello and welcome to Pause for Pedagogy. This is a conversation with Lindsay Hastings on developing generativity through leadership education, mentoring as pedagogical tool. And we're with the International Leadership Association. My name is Dan Jenkins, and I'm Director and Assistant Professor of Leadership and Organizational Studies at the University of Southern Maine and co-editor of our Pause for Pedagogy series. So the ILA and I are thrilled to welcome Lindsay to our latest conversation in the Pause for Pedagogy series. Welcome, Lindsay.
Great, thank you. Glad to be here.
We're excited to have you. Can you please tell us just a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Well, I'm on the leadership faculty at the University of Nebraska, and I also serve as the director of Nebraska Human Resources Institute, which is a leadership mentoring program here at the university.
Excellent. And how long have you been involved with ILA?
Oh, good question. Oh gosh, probably 3 or 4 years now. I came on the faculty 3 years ago, but I had been serving as the director of Nebraska Human Resources Institute prior to that, and had some exposure to ILA.
Excellent, excellent. So we're excited to have your article published and probably be in the next month or so. We've been working with lots of authors, doing some really interesting work and finding some really interesting work that has been done all around the world. At this point, we've got some folks from Canada and from Japan that have been contributing to this series, and this is definitely an important one. And so let's see, what were some of the key questions that you were hoping to answer when you were writing this article?
Sure, great question. So the United States is poised to experience its largest transfers of wealth and leadership in its history. So a big question I was trying to answer through this article is how might leadership education evolve to prepare students to contribute to this transfer of leadership and not just consume this transfer of wealth.
Okay, so when you think about generativity in that context, was that a term that you kind of took from the LID model, leadership identity development model, or did you look a little bit? Did you look beyond that? I mean, what was some of the I'd say the influence or the motivation for using that in your scholarship?
Yeah, great question. So I actually had a chance to connect with a scholar out of Stanford a number of years ago who did quite a bit of work with Dan McAdams and Ed de Saint-Aubin, who were some of the seminal authors in generativity. And when I shared with him a little bit about what we do in our leadership mentoring program, he said, "Hey, have you ever looked into generativity?" And I'm saying, genera what? It sounded like a made-up word. But then I got into Erik Erikson's work and saw his stages of psychosocial development, which is where the term generativity came from, and also realized that there wasn't much work being done in the intersection between generativity and leadership. Susan Comavez and her colleagues being some of the only ones to take a look at the intersection between generativity and leadership. And for those of your viewers who are unaware, Susan Comavez and her colleagues looked at leadership identity among college students, and the results of their research revealed that students enter what they called stage 5 of their leadership identity development model when they start to express generativity in their leadership identity. They start to express care and concern for establishing and guiding the next generation.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, I know. Teaching that in class, it's always, certainly to traditional undergrads, the metaphor or the example we use is when you came into your position, did you get a binder?
Yeah.
Was there some tangible something that you were provided? And obviously, you hope for more than that, whether it's a mentorship or some of these other things. But how do you build for that next group coming in? What does the Boy Scouts always say? Leave the campsite better than you found it, and so
Mm-hmm. So it's that whole notion of legacy building. And what's interesting about generativity out of Erik Erikson's work, Erikson saw generativity as being a midlife construct. And in fact, decades of research after Erikson's work documented that people tend to peak in their ability to be generative when they're middle-aged. College students are not regarded as being highly generative. But what's interesting is that because of this significant leadership transfer, we won't be able to wait for our students to become middle-aged before generativity and socially responsible leadership will be demanded of them. And Alice Rossi in 2001, and there were a variety of other scholars, identified that generativity has emerged as one of the strongest predictors of social responsibility. So developing generativity becomes an important proxy for developing social responsibility and socially responsible leadership, which I think many of our students will be demanded of them early in their careers to demonstrate socially responsible leadership in potentially senior roles.
Very good. At some point, I want to ask you how you think this might be applied to non-traditional students, but let's wait till the end. So,
okay.
Planting that seed. So tell me a little bit more about some of the practice or pedagogy you discussed in your article. Where did the idea or need for this work come from? You did talk about certainly some of the financial needs and where some of the distribution or the that's the word I'm looking for. The wealth will all be in this place, with a high percentage being with this group. But what was a little bit more about some of the practice and pedagogy?
Sure. So we know a few things from research about what develops generativity. A variety of antecedents have been identified, two of which involve mentoring. Peterson and Stewart in 1996 identified the results of their research revealed that those who are mentored tend to be more generative. We did a study in 2015 where the results of our research indicated that those who mentor tend to be more generative than their peers. And then the third antecedent is community involvement, which leadership education has addressed, I think, quite successfully. I joked at the Association of Leadership Educators conference that any leadership student across the country can't swing a dead cat without hitting a service learning or community involvement opportunity. Mentoring, on the other hand, is something we cross our fingers and hope for during a student's experience, but it may or may not be something we systematically involve in our leadership education offerings. And that may be something that we want to look at, knowing that mentoring develops generativity. Generativity is a predictor of social responsibility.
Right. Yeah. And certainly if, for any of our listeners that have been, or watchers that have been part of a mentoring program, it takes a village to do the administration, to pair, to find the volunteers, to place and pair people up. And, I had a graduate student in our program recently that was looking at reverse mentoring. Have you ever seen that? And so he found some just amazing findings. We don't think about that. We always think, well, let's pair, the young whippersnapper with the old guard, and in some ways, we have as much to learn, or I'd say in many ways, we have as much to learn from those that are coming in with new ideas or are newer to the organization than those that have been there for decades or more. And sometimes it's just creating those opportunities for conversation. And who knows, maybe we should start pairing freshmen with our vice presidents for student affairs.
Absolutely. Honestly, there's so much to be gained. What we know definitely about mentoring is that there is reciprocal influence. And mentoring, no matter how we do it, if the student is being the mentor or being mentored, either way, you're likely to develop generativity.
So it's interesting. So what were some of the learning outcomes, some of the specific learning outcomes for this practice or pedagogy, and how has your team been assessing whether those outcomes are being met?
Yeah, great question. Generally, when we're talking about mentoring for the purpose of leadership development, we're talking about outcomes generally in personal development and leadership empowerment. And through our leadership mentoring program, we assess personal development and leadership empowerment, both formatively and summatively in a variety of ways. So for example, all of the college student leaders who are in our mentoring program, they're placed in what are called projects, which is a fancy word for small groups, based on the age or the school of their mentee. So for example, all of the college student leaders who work with first through third graders, they are in what's called Child's Project. Every project meets weekly to discuss the development and outcomes of their respective mentoring relationships. So for example, in a Child's Project meeting, every student would go around and talk about what they did with their mentee that week. So for example, I might share, this week I did a body tracing activity with my mentee where we identified our own leadership strengths within the body, and then we wrote on each other's body on the outside strengths we see in each other. I identified that my mentee sees herself as a strong listener, and so I challenged her this week to spend 5 minutes actively listening to her younger brother that week. So that might be an example of how students are sharing and giving each other advice and feedback on the development and outcomes of their mentoring relationship. Then more summatively, at the end of each school year, we have a a day called Annual Recognition Day. At this event, each mentoring pair comes up with a symbol of their mentoring relationship to document the progress and outcome of their relationship. So, for example, for students who are early in their relationship, they may document their progress in building a foundation of trust and friendship, whereas older mentoring pairs may document through their symbol how they've been reinvesting in others and how they documented that throughout the year. Now, ultimately, we want to see that mentoring develops generativity. That's what we've been interested in. So we've been using more empirical research to answer that question. A few years ago, we examined generativity levels among our students, and we compared them against college student leaders who are not mentoring and against general college students. And what we saw there was that indeed, college student leaders who mentor are significantly more generative. But each type of mentoring experience, even though I'm talking about what we did in our program, each type of mentoring experience will generate unique leadership development experiences and outcomes. So, for example, the Multi-Institute Study of Leadership, the MSL, showed us that while faculty mentoring will likely impact the majority of the values associated with the social change model, peer mentoring can actually fill in the gaps and impact social change values like commitment and collaboration. What we know from Susan Comavez and her colleagues' work in 2009, peer mentoring actually increases in significance as a student moves through their college experience. So peer mentoring may mean less to a freshman than it does to a junior. A junior may see more value in a peer mentoring experience. When students serve as mentors, what we know is that we should expect sharpened leadership competencies and things like a larger sphere of influence, higher attributed esteem, increase in pride, satisfaction, and confidence. And a variety of measures could be used to assess this. I mean, chief among them, the Socially Responsible Leadership Scale, the SRLS.
That's really interesting. I wonder, a freshman, for example, they may not know what they need out of a mentor yet because they're still getting acclimated to being a college student, and perhaps I'm just thinking about what could be some of the reasoning or the causation for some of those findings. But you don't know what you don't know, and so at what stages does a mentor make a more significant impact? And because certainly we need mentors at every stage, or your findings are suggesting that.
Mm-hmm.
Have you found are there any significant differences between the different stages that have come out beyond what you were mentioning?
That's a great question. Meaning, like, what outcomes might we expect in a freshman versus a sophomore versus a junior?
Sure.
That's a great question. In fact, any of your viewers out there who are graduate students, I'd love to lure you to the University of Nebraska to help answer some of those questions. In fact, that's part of what we're looking for moving forward. We want to see how generativity, for example, develops at each stage. So we want to know when a student enters a mentoring experience, what's their generativity level as compared to their third year as a mentor? What sort of changes are we seeing there? And I think it could warrant even larger investigation around how is a student impacted by faculty mentoring differently or peer mentoring differently throughout a student's experience. So any graduate student out there, love to work with you.
No, that's really interesting, and to focus on that specific indicator or area of the social responsible leadership scale, because it's one of the few assessments we have out there to look specifically at that attribute. So very interesting. So what do you see next? I mean, what's the future research and the writing around this area? What are you going to work on next as you think about this research?
Yeah, great question. Right now, we're examining the relationship between generativity and motivation to lead. So we're trying to more fully answer the question of mentoring's role in leadership empowerment. As I mentioned, we're looking at the development of generativity. So we want to know how mentoring develops a person's generativity over time. So what we know right now is that college student leaders who mentor tend to be more generative, but is that always going to be the case? As in, does a student come in with a sort of seed of generativity already planted? Or does the mentoring experience actually develop it even farther? So we're looking to compare upperclassmen versus underclassmen in that regard.
Sure. And so that seed I planted about 10 minutes ago. So how do you see this affecting non-traditional students? I mean, I think about the student body at the university that I teach at is we're just over 50% transfer non-traditional students, and so we have a significant. In fact, in our leadership and organizational studies programs specifically, about 80% of our students are non-traditional. Our undergrads are usually their late 20s, early 30s, and they're working in a variety of fields. And, how do you see this type of research or this practice or these outcomes? Again, this is completely, your hypotheses, but,
Yeah.
or perhaps you've done some work on it. What are some of the things you've been thinking about that population?
You're asking a great question. As of right now, I could tell you we'd have to extrapolate earlier research findings. So what we know is that from Peterson and Stewart in '96, that being mentored is a developmental antecedent for generativity, but that has not been investigated in non-traditional students. So it's a very interesting research question, which I'm thinking you should build your own graduate cohort there in Maine to study that question. It's an excellent one. Additionally, Cindy Kane and I are going to be doing a new direction series on the role of mentoring, coaching, and advising in leadership development. And part of what we're asking also is what about online students? What is the role of mentoring, coaching, and advising in online environments? Because as college student populations are going to continue to move more online, how do we make sure that the benefits derived from mentoring aren't lost just because students are functioning in an online space?
Right. Yeah, we have plenty of. In fact, we've become the largest online major in our system, and so we try to recreate a lot of what has been traditionally done in the brick and mortar classroom into leadership through lots of online experiential and experimental pedagogy, and that's just one more thing that we think about how do you translate service learning to the online and virtual environment. We've done things as interesting as micro volunteering, and in the end, we find that students tend to volunteer in the communities nearest to them anyway. I wonder if the same would be true with mentoring. Would they choose to find mentors or mentor, to be a mentee with or mentor those in their communities versus trying to pair somebody up with somebody through Skype or Google Hangouts or something like that. So, So anything else you'd love to add or share based on some of this work?
Just at the end of the day, I think it's important for us as leadership educators to know that mentoring can take on a lot of forms and still be successful in developing generativity and therefore social responsibility. So its utility in leadership development is something to be heavily considered. And for any of your viewers who are interested in learning more, I'm happy to provide research on this. So as you go vie for these kinds of programs, I can help you swing with a heavy bat.
Great. No, thank you so much, Lindsay. And thanks to our viewers for joining us today. So Pause for Pedagogy is an initiative of the Leadership Education Member Interest Group of the International Leadership Association, and articles and videos are available at www.ila-net.org, and you can follow us on Twitter at @the_ILA. Thanks so much, Lindsay.
Thanks, Dan.